I am Jaxon, and in this episode, I'm examining 7 cases where encounters with bears turned fatal, not in unmarked wilderness with no warning. From a woman who treated grizzly territory like a backyard to a wildlife photographer who baited a sun bear into dense tropical brush before sunrise. Let's start with the first story, where a 346-pound woman ignored all rules in a grizzly country. It was July 26, 2025, outside Whitefish, Montana, where forested residential neighborhoods pressed up against grizzly country, and longtime residents understood what living in that landscape required of them. The area sits within the Greater Glacier ecosystem, one of the most intact grizzly habitats remaining in the contiguous United States, and the people who had lived there for years operated with a practical daily awareness of what sharing territory with apex predators actually meant. Zephyrah Vale, 34, was a 346-pound freelance digital artist who had recently relocated from Las Vegas after inheriting money from a deceased relative. She purchased a wooded property on the outskirts of town and spent most of her time online, publicly documenting her transition into rural life as a personal reset. She had no prior experience living in bear country, and neighbors recognized the problem almost immediately after her arrival. Multiple residents made direct efforts to explain how things worked. Secure garbage in locked containers, remove bird feeders, keep pet food inside, stay indoors during nighttime hours when bears are most active. These weren't vague suggestions. They were specific, practical instructions drawn from years of first-hand experience in that exact area. Zephyrah acknowledged none of it in practice. Within weeks, overflowing trash bags were piled beside her porch. Fast food wrappers accumulated across the yard, and cooking grease had been dumped behind the house on multiple occasions. One of the most potent bear attractants available, carrying scent signatures across extraordinary distances. Pet food was regularly left out overnight. Neighbors began reporting a large grizzly moving through the area near her property repeatedly. Local wildlife officers distributed notices throughout the neighborhood, reminding all homeowners to secure food attractants following the ongoing sightings. From everything I've studied about grizzly behavior in residential areas, this pattern is well documented and deeply concerning once it starts. A food-conditioned bear doesn't stumble across unsecured trash as a one-time event. It learns a route. It maps a specific property to reliable, low-effort food. And every night those bags were accessible, that association was being reinforced in the animal's behavioral pattern. Grizzly bears possess a sense of smell roughly 7 times more powerful than a bloodhound, capable of detecting food from several miles away. Adult males in the northern Rockies typically weigh between 400 and 600 pounds and can reach speeds up to 35 miles per hour. When a bear becomes food-conditioned, repeatedly exposed to human food waste with no negative consequence, its natural wariness around human spaces erodes progressively. That shift removes the behavioral buffer that typically keeps bears and people from direct contact. Shortly after midnight on July 26th, Zephyrah was woken by loud metallic banging outside. Trash cans near her porch had been overturned. Hearing wet tearing sounds from the stairs area, she stepped outside carrying only a flashlight, apparently assuming raccoons or stray dogs were responsible, as similar disturbances had occurred before. The bear was directly beside the porch stairs, actively tearing through garbage bags. The distance between them when she stepped through the door was extremely short. Neighbors reported hearing a scream followed immediately by violent sounds of a struggle. Zephyrah had turned and attempted to retreat to the front door, but slipped on loose gravel at close range. The bear, startled during active feeding, responded with immediate aggression. Multiple nearby residents called emergency services. She succumbed to her injuries before medical evacuation arrived at the property. Investigators confirmed the bear had become food-conditioned through weeks of exposure to unsecured waste across the neighborhood, with her property functioning as a primary attractant site. Wildlife officers euthanized the animal several days later after it continued returning to nearby homes. This case is hard to process, not because the attack was unpredictable, but because of how many specific, reasonable opportunities existed to prevent it. Every piece of advice she received was accurate, practical, and backed by years of local experience. Zephyr's case is a reminder that living in Grizzly country is an active, ongoing responsibility, not just a lifestyle choice. The next story takes us to Eastern Europe, where a tourist made a very different kind of mistake in full public view, with people actively trying to stop him. It was August 18, 2016, along a mountain road cutting through the Carpathian foothills outside Brașov County, Romania. The Carpathian mountain range holds one of the largest brown bear populations in Europe, and the roads threading through that region had developed a well-documented crisis, tourists stopping to photograph and feed the bears, creating a cycle of habituation that wildlife officers had been actively working to address for over a decade. Draven Rook, 29, was an adventure tourist from Australia traveling through the Carpathian region as part of a backpacking trip through Eastern Europe. Among his social circle, he was known for seeking out reckless and attention-generating situations during travel. He had heard stories from other travelers about the roadside bears near Brașov and became increasingly fixated on interacting with one. He showed no indication of understanding or caring about the history behind why those bears behaved the way they did. While driving along the mountain road, his group encountered a large brown bear standing near roadside barriers at a pull-off where tourists commonly stopped. Other drivers nearby were actively warning people to remain inside their vehicles. The situation was not ambiguous. Warnings were verbal, direct, and coming from multiple people within feet of Draven's vehicle. His companions encouraged him to approach the bear and offer it food anyway. I want to be direct about this. The people in that vehicle who encouraged him carry real moral weight in what followed. Treating a habituated wild bear as entertainment and pushing someone toward it for a reaction isn't harmless peer pressure. It's a deliberate push toward a situation that wildlife professionals had spent years trying to prevent. European brown bears in the Carpathian region typically weigh between 300 and 660 pounds. A single swipe from a standing adult can deliver enough force to fracture bone and tear through muscle tissue in one motion. Habituation does not produce tameness. It produces an animal tolerant of humans at moderate distance and explosively unpredictable the moment that distance is breached. Draven exited the vehicle carrying sandwich meat and moved toward the bear on foot. The animal remained calm initially, consistent with a bear accustomed to being approached and fed by tourists at that location over many years. He continued moving closer and attempted to make direct physical contact with the animal. The bear swiped him to the ground without warning. Draven attempted to scramble backward across the gravel road shoulder. The bear continued toward him aggressively. His companions threw objects at the animal in an attempt to drive it away, but the steep surrounding terrain and narrow road made any effective physical intervention nearly impossible. Emergency responders confirmed he had not survived prior to evacuation. Romanian wildlife officials reiterated publicly what had been stated for years. The illegal feeding pattern had directly produced the ongoing public safety crisis along those mountain corridors. The bear was not destroyed. Its behavior was entirely consistent with a habituated animal pushed past its threshold by direct physical contact at close range. What I keep coming back to with this case is the complete visibility of every warning. People were actively telling him not to do it at that exact moment. The outcome was predictable to nearly everyone present, and that is the part most difficult to move past. That case played out in front of witnesses who actively tried to stop it and couldn't. The next story moves to northern Japan, where a woman's certainty that she understood the situation better than trained professionals standing beside her led to a confrontation no one could prevent. It was May 3, 2014. In the rural interior of Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost main island, where dense mixed forest bordered cleared farmland and early spring had brought bears out of winter dormancy. May is a particularly sensitive month in Hokkaido's bear country. Females with cubs born over the winter are mobile and actively foraging, and the combination of nutritional demand and cub protection instinct makes the species significantly more reactive to human encounters during this period than at any other time of year. Callistrix Meyer, 41, was an exotic animal enthusiast from Oregon who operated a small online platform focused on unconventional pet ownership. She had a documented history of confrontations with wildlife authorities over illegal possession of restricted animals, including imported mammals prohibited under federal and state law. During a personal photography trip through rural Hokkaido, she spotted what appeared to be a lone bear cub near the edge of a forest clearing, while exploring areas bordering forest terrain. Local forestry workers present in the area moved quickly to intercept her. Their warning was immediate and specific: do not approach the cub. This was not general caution. It was location-based guidance grounded in a well-understood principle. Bear cubs found alone in the open in Hokkaido during spring are almost never abandoned. A mother bear is almost always concealed nearby in dense brush, monitoring her cub and fully capable of responding to a perceived threat within seconds. Callistrix disregarded the warning entirely. Convinced the cub had been abandoned, she moved toward it and began attempting to guide it toward a pet carrier she had brought in her rental vehicle, apparently intending to take the animal. Before addressing what followed, the maternal brown bear response deserves a direct look. Usuri brown bears, the subspecies native to Hokkaido, are the largest bears in Asia. Adult females typically weigh between 220 and 440 pounds. Adult males can reach up to 880 pounds. A sow defending her cub does not move through a gradual warning sequence that provides time to react. The cub's distress sounds carried into the nearby brush almost immediately. The mother bear emerged from cover within seconds. A forestry worker called for Callistrix to back away slowly and calmly. She froze near the carrier. The mother charged before anyone could physically intervene. Callistrix had no time and no viable option. Authorities recovered her damaged camera equipment near the scene during the subsequent investigation. The forestry team used the incident as the foundation for updated public advisory materials, specifically targeting tourists who misidentify lone-appearing cubs as abandoned animals. In my opinion, what makes this case uniquely frustrating is that it wasn't an ambush. She was warned by qualified people standing right there and made a conscious, deliberate decision to proceed. Her background with captive exotic animals had built a conviction that she possessed relevant expertise in animal behavior. Approaching a bear cub is one of the most consistently documented fatal errors in bear country worldwide. The forestry workers knew that firsthand. Their warning was accurate, specific, and completely disregarded. That case was defined by personal conviction, overriding on-the-ground expertise in a situation where the expertise was standing right beside her. The next story moves to Kodiak Island, Alaska, where a young hunter's single impulsive action in one critical moment turned a professional expedition into a crisis no one could stop. It was October 11th, 2017, on Kodiak Island, Alaska, where fast-moving salmon streams carved through dense alder brush and cottonwood stands along valley floors, and where some of the largest bears on Earth gathered along those banks in concentrated numbers to feed before the onset of winter. The terrain on Kodiak Island is demanding even by Alaskan standards, heavily vegetated, uneven, and consistently difficult to move through quickly when a situation escalates. Thorne Varell, 24, was a warehouse employee who had spent several years setting money aside for what he described as a dream hunting expedition to Alaska. He had developed a deep interest in hunting culture and wilderness survival through years of online content, firearm forums, backcountry hunting channels, survival video series, and booked a guided big game expedition through a small independent outfitting operation on Kodiak Island, despite having limited hands-on field experience with live dangerous game. Professional guides who worked alongside him described him in accounts provided to investigators as impulsive and overconfident with firearms in active field situations. Someone whose knowledge had been built in formats that couldn't fully replicate the judgment required when a real encounter unfolded in front of him. During the expedition, the group encountered a massive Kodiak bear feeding beside a salmon stream and displaying visible signs of agitation and territorial behavior around its feeding site. The lead guide directed everyone immediately into a controlled, slow group retreat, the correct protocol for that situation, designed to increase distance without triggering a direct threat response. The physical profile of Kodiak bears matters here. They are the largest subspecies of brown bear in North America. Adult males regularly weigh between 800 and 1,500 pounds and can stand close to 10 feet tall when upright. During fall hyperphagia, the intensive feeding period before hibernation, they are at their most territorial and most reactive around food sources. A Kodiak charge reaches speeds approaching 35 miles per hour, closing roughly 30 feet per second across whatever terrain lies between the animal and the target. A wounded bear is not a deterred bear. This is one of the most fundamental principles in large carnivore hunting, documented consistently across every species and region where it applies. A shot that causes pain without incapacitating the animal does not produce retreat. It produces escalation from an animal driven by pain and adrenaline at full physical capability. Every professional guide working with dangerous large game treats this as a baseline certainty. While the group was carefully navigating the uneven rocks along the stream bank during the guided retreat, Thorne stepped forward and fired before the guide could physically stop him. The shot struck the bear across the shoulder. It was not incapacitating. The bear charged immediately through the shallow water and across the rocky stream bed toward the group. The guide attempted defensive fire, but the short distance and difficult footing along the rock-strewn bank allowed almost no time to respond effectively. Thorne did not survive the encounter. Investigators concluded specifically that the attack had escalated as a direct result of the wound. An undisturbed Kodiak bear, given adequate distance, would in most circumstances have moved away. A wounded one at close range, with a rocky stream channel behind the group and no clean retreat path available, was a categorically different situation. I think about this case whenever the question comes up about the difference between being passionate about the outdoors and being genuinely prepared for it. The next story takes us to the high Arctic, to the sea ice of Svalbard, Norway, where a wealthy traveler separated from her group on open ice and came face to face with the only bear species on Earth that approaches humans as potential prey. It was November 22nd, 2013, across the sea ice of Svalbard, Norway, where polar night had settled over the archipelago, and temperatures on the exposed surface dropped well below 0 Fahrenheit. Wind-driven snow reduced visibility across flat terrain that offered no landmarks, no cover, and no natural barrier between a person on the ice and whatever else was moving across it. Isolde Veleth, 38, was a luxury fashion entrepreneur from France, with a private fixation on authentic Arctic materials and exclusive wildlife imagery collected outside the constraints of legal sourcing. She arranged a private expedition into remote Svalbard with 2 unlicensed guides known for taking wealthy clients into restricted areas, operating entirely outside the licensed tourism framework and its associated safety requirements, emergency communication protocols, and wildlife management guidelines. The guides warned her before each excursion onto the ice. Their warnings were specific and grounded in field experience. Polar bears in the high Arctic are not comparable to any other bear species. They are not startled by human presence the way brown or black bears are. They do not respond to deterrence in the same way. They are active predators operating in a landscape where the prey base is limited and must be actively sought across vast distances, and a lone human on open ice is, in the right circumstances, a viable target. Polar bears are the largest land carnivore on Earth. Adult males in Svalbard commonly weigh between 770 and 1,300 pounds and can measure over 8 feet in body length. They can detect prey by scent from distances of up to 20 miles and locate a seal's breathing hole through 3 feet of packed ice. Unlike brown bears, which are primarily defensive in attacks on humans, polar bears approach humans with what field researchers consistently identify as predatory intent, calmly, deliberately, and almost always from downwind. During a snowmobile excursion across the sea ice, the group spotted a lone polar bear moving across the surface several hundred yards away through blowing snow and reduced visibility. The guides took up a defensive position and assessed the situation. Isolde quietly separated from the group and moved toward the bear on foot with her camera equipment, operating under the belief that wind direction was masking her position and scent from the animal. Polar bears navigate Arctic terrain primarily by scent, and wind direction provides only partial, unreliable concealment against an animal whose olfactory sensitivity can detect prey from miles across featureless terrain. Movement across bright, reflective open ice is additionally detectable at ranges far beyond standard human visual awareness in low visibility conditions. The bear turned and oriented toward her position. One of the guides fired warning shots after hearing her scream carry across the ice. Blowing snow and engine noise from the snowmobiles created disorientation about direction and distance. By the time the guides reached her location on the ice, she had already sustained catastrophic injuries and could not be saved. I've gone through enough Arctic field incident reports to be direct about what that situation actually was the moment she separated from the group. On open sea ice, when a polar bear has identified a lone person and begun closing the distance, survival depends almost entirely on effective deterrence from someone else reaching them in time. There is no cover, no barrier, no structure between the person and the animal. The geography provides every advantage to the predator. Norwegian authorities opened a formal investigation into the guides for operating without proper licensing in a protected Arctic zone, and without the safety infrastructure that licensed polar bear expeditions are required to maintain. The next story takes us to central India, where a travel vlogger spent years publicly dismissing professional safety guidance and then walked alone into active sloth bear territory before the sun came up. It was June 9, 2018, in the forested interior of Madhya Pradesh, India, where the hours before dawn brought near total darkness through dense deciduous brush, pressing humidity, and near zero visibility for anyone moving without specialized equipment. Sloth bear activity peaks in the pre-dawn hours when termite mound foraging is most productive, and the wildlife trackers at the small private jungle camp where Jaxon was staying operated with years of location-specific knowledge about which forest zones were active, what signs indicated recent bear presence, and exactly what the consequences of ignoring that information looked like in practice. Jaxon, 47, was a travel vlogger from the United Kingdom who had built a following by positioning himself as someone willing to bypass the protocols of organized tourism in favor of what he called authentic wilderness access. His content regularly framed professional guides and safety restrictions as obstacles to genuine experience rather than as the accumulated knowledge of people who had spent careers in exactly those environments. During his stay, he became openly frustrated when wildlife trackers refused to permit tourists to wander independently through areas with confirmed active sloth bear presence. Before sunrise on June 9th, Jaxon left camp alone without informing any staff member and moved into the forest carrying a flashlight and camera equipment. Sloth bears are consistently and dangerously underestimated, and it is worth addressing that directly. Adults weigh between 120 and 310 pounds, smaller than the other bears in this episode, but they are responsible for more human fatalities per year in parts of India than tigers. They have poor eyesight and rely heavily on smell and hearing. When a human appears suddenly at close range, particularly in darkness through dense brush with no advance warning, the defensive response is explosive and immediate. The trackers at that camp knew all of this from direct field experience. Their restriction on independent movement through active bear zones in pre-dawn darkness was not overcaution. It was the practical application of location-specific knowledge about what that forest contained and what it did to people who moved through it unprepared. Jaxon moved into dense forest and entered an area where a mother sloth bear and her cub were actively foraging for termites in the undergrowth. The bear detected him at close range and stood upright suddenly, only feet away. Instead of freezing and backing away slowly, the only behavior that provides any realistic chance of de-escalation, Jaxon ran through the brush. The attack was immediate. Search teams located scattered, damaged equipment across the area after camp staff discovered his absence in the early morning hours. Kadrik was found nearby. Forest officials classified the death as a wildlife fatality, resulting from unauthorized entry into a restricted active bear zone, and incorporated the incident into updated safety briefing protocols, reinforcing mandatory wildlife escort compliance across all designated bear active areas within the reserve. This case follows a sequence that experienced trackers have documented for decades. A person alone, in dense vegetation, in the dark, in confirmed bear territory, with no backup and no trained response capability. The outcome was entirely predictable to every trained person on that camp's staff. Kadrik had built a public identity on the argument that professional wildlife guidance was an obstacle to authentic experience. The forest was completely indifferent to that argument. The final case in this episode takes us to Southeast Asia, where a young wildlife photographer from New Zealand made a series of decisions in a rainforest fruit orchard before sunrise that no amount of photographic experience could compensate for. It was June 2, 2016, near the forest edge of a rainforest reserve in Sabah, Malaysia, where fruit orchards pressed up against the boundary of dense lowland tropical forest, and wildlife moved freely between the two environments in the hours before full daylight. The staff at the small private camp where Nix Arden was staying understood this well. Nix Arden, 27, was a freelance wildlife photographer from New Zealand who had been traveling through Southeast Asia for several months, documenting rare animals for her social media platforms and contributing images to independent travel publications. She had built a genuine reputation as a skilled photographer of birds and reptiles, patient, methodical, and capable of producing quality images in difficult field conditions. But her knowledge of bear behavior was, by all accounts, extremely limited. People who knew her work described a consistent and well-established pattern. She was driven by a desire for unusually close, intimate wildlife images and consistently avoided long telephoto lenses in favor of physical proximity. That preference had served her well with birds and reptiles. It had not been tested against a bear in dense tropical vegetation before sunrise. While staying near the reserve, Nix overheard plantation workers discussing repeated sun bear sightings at a fruit orchard near the forest boundary. The bear had been observed entering the orchard at dawn on multiple occasions, feeding on fallen fruit before retreating into the forest as full daylight strengthened. Rangers working in the area had already issued warnings to visitors, specifically noting that sun bears, despite their smaller size relative to other species, are capable of highly aggressive and rapid defensive behavior when cornered, surprised, or approached at close range inside confined vegetation. Those warnings were distributed and clearly communicated to people staying in the area. They did not change Nix's plans. On the morning of June 2nd, before first light, Nix entered the orchard alone, carrying camera equipment and a quantity of cut fruit she had prepared, with the intention of using it as a wildlife attractant near the forest edge. She placed the fruit near dense undergrowth at the orchard's border and moved into position to photograph whatever the scent brought in. Investigators who reviewed the incident later concluded that the cut fruit's scent had very likely drawn the bear directly into the thick vegetation bordering the orchard, the exact area into which Nix had positioned herself in the pre-dawn darkness. Sun bears deserve a direct look here because the assumptions people bring to them are almost entirely shaped by size, and size is the least relevant factor in understanding the danger. Sun bears are the smallest bear species in the world. Adults weigh between 60 and 145 pounds. They are found throughout Southeast Asian tropical forests and spend significant portions of their active hours foraging in dense undergrowth. Their curved claws can reach up to 4 inches in length, developed for tearing into trees and breaking open insect colonies, but fully capable of inflicting severe lacerations at close range. As light began filtering through the canopy on the morning of June 2nd, Nix moved toward the area where she had spotted the bear near fallen fruit at the undergrowth's edge. She crouched and worked her way closer through the brush, attempting to position herself for eye-level photographs through the vegetation. Plantation workers later stated their belief that the dense terrain and minimal early morning light caused her to lose direct visual contact with the bear entirely as she advanced, a situation that, in confined tropical undergrowth, places a person in extremely close proximity to an animal they can no longer see, track, or anticipate. From everything I've looked into in wildlife photography incidents, this specific dynamic, losing visual contact with a large animal in dense vegetation while continuing to move toward its last known position, is one of the most consistently documented precursors to close-range encounters that go wrong. Once you can no longer see the animal, you are navigating entirely on assumption. In dense tropical brush before sunrise, that is not a viable safety strategy under any circumstance. Moments later, the bear emerged from the undergrowth only feet away after Nix unknowingly stepped directly into the animal's escape path through the confined vegetation. At that distance, with dense brush on all sides and no viable retreat available to either party, the sun bear's defensive response was immediate. It reared and delivered a rapid series of slashing strikes at her upper body before retreating back through the vegetation and disappearing into the forest. Plantation workers in the area heard shouting from the direction of the orchard and moved toward the sound. Thick brush along the orchard edge and uneven terrain significantly delayed their ability to locate her. By the time workers reached Nix, she had sustained severe injuries to her upper body. Workers attempted to control the bleeding while emergency services were contacted. She succumbed to her injuries from severe blood loss before evacuation could be completed. Wildlife officials concluded that the encounter had escalated primarily because the bear had been enclosed in confined vegetation with no clear escape route at the moment of contact, a condition created directly by Nix moving into the dense undergrowth after losing visual contact with the animal. The presence of cut fruit as bait had drawn the bear into that specific pocket of heavy vegetation, placing it in exactly the confined terrain where a defensive response at close range was most likely. The bear was not destroyed. Its behavior was entirely consistent with a startled animal reacting defensively when cornered with no available retreat. I want to be direct about the baiting, because it tends to be underweighted when these incidents are discussed. Using food to draw a wild bear into dense vegetation, and then entering that same vegetation to photograph it, doesn't just increase the probability of an encounter. It shapes the entire encounter almost entirely in the animal's favor. The bear is in its chosen location, in familiar terrain, with no reason to leave.